Who is considered to be the father of English novel? Henry Fielding. Who among the following is not novelist? Matthew Arnold. Who is Samuel Johnson? Critics. Emily Bronte is A. Novelist. Who of the following is not a romantic poet? John Milton. In which century was the Age of Sensibility period? '18th century. One of the four mentioned below is not a novelist of modern age in English language. Who is he? Charles Dickens. Who among the following is not dramatist? Edmund Burke. Who is called the father of both the regional and the historical novel? Walter Scott. Who is the father of modern English poetry? Geoffrey Chaucer. Who is called the father of modern English criticism? John Dryden. Who is the father of English learning? Venerable Bede. What was the real name of the great American short story writer, O. Henry? William Sidney Porter. Who among the following is not belongs to a Gaston period? Henry Fielding. Who is called the father of revenge tragedy? Thomas Kidd. Who among the following is not dramatist? Edmund Burke. Robert Browning belongs to Victorian age. Who is the poet of the Victorian poet? Matthew Arnold. In which century was the Victorian period? '19th century. Who of the following is not a Victorian poet? Alexander Pope, and a priest. George Herbert. Who is the most famous satirist in English literature? Jonathan Swift. Shakespeare's measure for measure is a successful comedy. There is nothing either good or bad but thinking makes it so, is a famous dialogue from Hamlet. Marlowe's first play, which was staged on a regular commercial stage in London, is Tamburlaine the Great. William Shakespeare is not the author of White Devil. In which play would you find the character Lady Capulet? Romeo and Juliet. When was the Globe Theatre built? December 28, 1598. By which year it is thought that William Shakespeare's Palace were being regularly performed in London? 1592. In what city does A Midsummer Night's Dream take place? Athens. One of the four mentioned below is Shakespeare's shortest play. The Comedy of Errors. Which of the following is not tragedy? Much Ado About Nothing. Who is the dramatist that introduced blank verse as a form of dramatic expression in his plays? Christopher Marlowe. In which play would you find the character Mephistopheles? Dr. Faustus. Christopher Marlowe is known as father of English tragedy. Sweet are the uses of adversity from which comedy the sentence has taken? As You Like It. Which is known as Shakespeare's Swan Song. The Tempest. Who is considered as the first English poet? Cadman. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, who said? Lady Macbeth. Which is not title of Shakespeare? Father of English tragedy. How many sonnets did Shakespeare write? (154). The Silent Woman was written by Ben Jonson. Lycidas is A. Elegy. Paradise Lost was published in which year? (1667). Which of the following works was not written by Jonathan Swift? Tom Jones. What is the height of the men in Lilliput? (6 inches). Who has written the poem Elegy written in a country churchyard? Thomas Gray. Milton. A poem was written by William Blake. Which of the following is not a character in Paradise Lost? Agony. Who wrote the famous poetic line "To err is human, to forgive is divine"? Alexander Pope. Who wrote Gulliver's Travels? Jonathan Swift. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness in the desert air. Who sat hated? Thomas Gray. In the mid-1700s, who was the first British poet that wrote elegy? Thomas Gray. What is Pope's poem The Rape of the Lock based on? A real fact. Charms strike the sight, but merit strikes the heart. Who stated? Alexander Pope. The Chimney Sweeper was written by William Blake. Samson Agonistes is A. Poetic drama. The Alchemist was written by Ben Jonson. Childhood shows the man as morning shows the day. Who said? John Milton. Famous poem An Essay on Man was written by Alexander Pope. Marriage of Helen Haven was written by William Blake. Who wrote Biographia Literaria? St. Coleridge. Why are the daffodils in Wordsworth's I wandered lonely as a cloud dancing? There was a strong wind. Who said beauty is truth, truth beauty? John Keats. Most important feature of the Romantic poetry is subjectivity. Who wrote the play The Borderers? William Wordsworth. Who has written, He prayeth best, who loveth best all things great and small? St. Coleridge. Poet of sensuousness. John Eliot is an English poet who is famous for the sensuousness. What do TS stand for? Thomas Stearns. Who wrote the famous poem The Second Coming? W. B. Yeats. Identify the poet of the verse Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. P. B. Shelley. What is the lifespan of William Wordsworth? (1770 to 1850). Who wrote Ode to a Nightingale? John Keats. 10,000 saw I at a glance. Who said this? William Wordsworth. The literary work Kubla Khan is a verse. Wordsworth is a poet. Romantic. When did T.S. Eliot get Nobel Prize for Literature? (1948). Wordsworth became a poet laureate in (1843). One of the four mentioned below is not P. B. Shelley's poem which on? Ode to Fancy. Famous poem Rainbow was written by William Wordsworth. The Cocktail Party was written by T.S. Eliot. Estelle is a famous character of Charles Dickens in Great Expectations. Who wrote The Apple Cart? Geo. George Bernard Shaw. Who wrote under the pseudonym Amerito? Edmund Spenser. Charity begins at home and justice begins next door. Quotation from which book? Great Expectations. Which of the following is not a character in Fairy Queen? Orsino. Who is the author of Doctor's Dilemma? George Bernard Shaw. The Ruins of Time was written by Edmund Spenser. Ernest Hemingway got Nobel Prize for which book? The Old Man in the Sea. Which of the following is not a character in Affair to Arms? Jake Barnes. Who is famous for his drama of ideas? George Bernard Shaw. Good fences make good neighbor. Who said? Robert Frost. What kind of work was home burial? Poem. George Bernard Shaw got Nobel Prize in (1925). Which of the following works was not written by Charles Dickens? Pygmalion. The novel Irrational Knot is by George Bernard Shaw. What types of work Indian camp? Short story. Which of the following works was not written by Spenser? Cats in the Rain. Mending Wall was written by Robert Frost. Who is the author of The Shepherd's Calendar? Edmund Spenser. For Whom the Bell Tolls was written by Ernest Hemingway. Orlando is an important character in As You Like It. Who is the author of The Man of Destiny? George Bernard Shaw. Who wrote under the pseudonym Amerito? Edmund Spenser. One of the four mentioned below is not P.B. Shelley's poem which on? Ode to Fancy. 10,000 saw I at a glance, who said this? William Wordsworth. Who wrote the poem Journey of the Magi? T.S. Eliot. Who is called Graveyard Poet? Thomas Gray. Famous poem and essay on man was written by Alexander Pope. Dejection, an ode was written by S.T. Coleridge. In the mid-1700s, who was the first British poet that wrote elegy? Thomas Gray. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Quote from William Wordsworth. Famous poem When Soft Voices Die was written by P.B. Shelley. Areopagitica was written by John Milton. Brevity is the soul of wit spoken by Polonius. A Shakespearean play consists of 5 acts. Sweet are the uses of adversity from which comedy the sentence has taken. As You Like It. Who is the dramatist that introduced blank verse as a form of dramatic expression in his plays? Christopher Marlowe. One of the four mentioned below is Shakespeare's shortest play. The Comedy of Errors. In which play would you find the character Lady Capulet? Romeo and Juliet. Marlowe's first play, which was staged on a regular commercial stage in London, is Tamburlaine the Great. London Town is found a living being in the work of Charles Dickens. Who has written the play Bull Pony? Ben Jonson. Elizabethan tragedy is centered on revenge. The poem Under the Greenwood Tree was written by William Shakespeare. Christopher Marlowe is Shakespeare's predecessor. Caliban is character of Shakespeare in The Tempest. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, stated by Alexander Pope. A Modest Proposal was written by Jonathan Swift. Who is the author of the book The Excursion? William Wordsworth. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Who said? John Keats. Who wrote the poem The Canonization? John Donne. The Night Piece to Julia is a famous lyric by Robert Herrick. Preface to Shakespeare was written by Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is called Glorious John. John Dryden. Which of the following books was not written by Sir Walter Scott? Pamela. Who wrote Ulysses? Alfred Tennyson. George and Tom are famous character of William Somerset Maugham in The Ant and Grasshopper. Which of the following books was not written by William Somerset Maugham? Woman in Love. Who wrote the short story The Captain Doll? D. H. Lawrence. Which of the following books was not written by William Makepeace Thackeray? Far from the Madding Crowd. Who is the author of the book Cabbage and Kings? William Sidney Porter. Eustacia is a character of The Return of the Native. Who introduced dramatic monologue in his poems? Robert Browning. A Doll's House was written by Henrik Ibsen. Who is called father of metaphysical poetry? John Donne. The Devil's Law Case by John Webster is a comedy. Into Daffodil's human life is compared with Morning's Dew. My Last Duchess was written by Robert Browning. Who is the author of the Book of Human Bondage? William Somerset Maugham. Vanity Fair was written by William Makepeace Thackeray. Who said he is not poor that has little, but desire much? Daniel Defoe. Who is the author of the book Silas Marner? George Eliot. The New Arabian Nights was written by R.L. Stevenson. Which of the following books was not written by Charlotte Brontë? A Little While. Who among the following is not belongs to Victorian period? Jane Austen. One of the four mentioned below is not George Eliot's novel which on? The Birthday Party. Who wrote the famous poem The Spanish Gypsy? George Eliot. Sonia is the character of which novel? War and Peace. Who used the pseudonym Currer Bell? Charlotte Brontë. A Room with a View was written by E.M. Foster. Who is the author of the book To the Lighthouse? Virginia Woolf. Astrophel and Stella was written by Sir Philip Sidney. Which of the following books was not written by Virginia Woolf? Typhoon. What kind of work was Romola? Novel. Friday is one of the main characters of Robinson Crusoe. Who is born in Ukraine but wrote his works in English? Joseph Conrad. The 4,000,000 was written by O. Henry. Who wrote The Jungle Book? Rudyard Kipling. What types of work shooting an elephant? Prose. Which of the following was not written by Harold Pinter? Angels and Demons. The Tin Drum was written by Gunter Grass. Who was famous for sea stories as he worked as a sailor? Joseph Conrad. Who is the author of the book Sixes and Sevens? William Sidney Porter. Famous short story The Telltale Heart was written by Edgar Allan Poe. Who is the author of the book God of Small Things? Aaron Hootie Roy. Who is Eric Arthur Blair? George Orwell. What kind of work was The Picture of Dorian Gray? Fiction. Who wrote The Three Musketeers? Alexander Dumas. Novum Organum was written by Francis Bacon. Who wrote Sherlock Holmes? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Death of a Salesman was written by Arthur Asher Miller. Which of the following books was written by Toni Morrison? The Bluest Eye. Which of the following books was not written by William Faulkner? Bread and Butter. Catiline was written by Henrik Ibsen. Who was the author of the book The Invisible Man? H.G. Wells. For God's sake hold your tongue and let me love. This line is written by John Donne. Protagonist indicates the leading character or actor in a play. Veni, Vidi, Vici. This quotation from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, writing an exact man. Who said this? Bacon. Who wrote the definition of love? Andrew Marvell. Which is not true of an English sonnet? It has 14 syllables in each line. Portia's famous character of Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice. Who among the following was not poet laureate? Matthew Arnold. Who was awarded Nobel Prize for the poem The Waste Land? T.S. Eliot. Who wrote Madame Bovary? Gustave Laubert. Who among the following is not a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Literature? William Hazlitt. Things Fall Apart was written by Chinua Achebe. Any one of the following pairs as literary collaborators. Eliot and Pound. Tess of the D'Urbervilles was written by Thomas Hardy. Fagin is famous character of Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist. Today we love what tomorrow we hate, today we seek what tomorrow we shun, today we desire what tomorrow we fear. Who said? Daniel Defoe. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, was stated by William Wordsworth. Yahoos is a famous character in Gulliver's Travels. Who is the author of the book 1984? George Orwell. Who is called Morning Star of Reformation? John Wycliffe. Who is the father of English novel? Henry Fielding. The Solitary Reaper was written by W. Wordsworth. To be, or not to be, that is the question, is a quote from the play Hamlet. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Who said? William Blake. The Merchant of Venice is a Shakespearean play about Amour. Which of the following books was not written by Virginia Woolf? Typhoon. One of the four mentioned below is not George Eliot's novel. Which on? The Birthday Party. Who is the author of the book Silas Marner? George Eliot. Which of the following books was not written by Sir Walter Scott? Pamela. Who is the dramatist that introduced blank verse as a form of dramatic expression in his plays? Christopher Marlowe. The Battle of Books was written by Jonathan Swift. One of the four mentioned below is not P.B. Shelley's poem. Which on? Ode to Fancy. For Whom the Bell Tolls was written by Ernest Hemingway. Mending Wall was written by Robert Frost. Which of the following works was not written by Charles Dickens? Pygmalion. Who is the author of The Trumpet Major? Thomas Hardy. The ring of the book was written by Robert Burwoning. Wordsworth became a poet laureate in (1843). Who wrote the famous poem The Second Coming? W. B. Yeats. Poet of sensuousness. John Keats. Most important feature of the Romantic poetry is subjectivity. Famous poem and essay on man was written by Alexander Pope. The Alchemist was written by Ben Jonson. Song on Shakespeare was written by John Milton. What is Pope's poem The Rape of the Lock based on? A real fact. Which of the following is not a character in Paradise Lost? Agony. The Lighthouse was written by Edgar Allan Poe. Who has written the poem Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard? Thomas Gray. Which of the following works was not written by Jonathan Swift? Tom Jones. The Silent Woman was written by Ben Jonson. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, who said? Lady Macbeth. Which is known as Shakespeare's Swan Song? The Tempest. Pilgrim's Progress was written by John Bunyan. In what city does A Midsummer Night's Dream take place? Athens. In which play would you find the character Iago? Othello. There is nothing either good or bad but thinking makes it so, is a famous dialogue from Hamlet. In which century was the Victorian period? Nineteenth century. Virginia Woolf belongs to the Georgian period. Who is the poet of the Victorian poet? Matthew Arnold. Who among the following is not novelist? Matthew Arnold. One of the four mentioned below is not a prose writer. Who is he? Thomas More.